January 28th, 1986. A Massachusetts mother stands in the VIP viewing area at Kennedy Space Center, watching the launch that was supposed to make her daughter a symbol of hope for millions of schoolchildren. Christa McAuliffe, chosen from over 11,000 aspiring teachers, is about to become the first civilian in space. Her family, her students, the nation all waiting for history. But behind the celebrations, engineers warned that cold temperatures could cripple the shuttle's O-rings, and NASA pressed forward anyway. The mother who watched her son burn alive on live T5 isn't just a story of a high-profile disaster. It's about how one family's brightest day turned into horror, and what no viewer at home could imagine was about to unfold. Grace Corrigan stands in the cold Florida morning, her VIP badge pressed flat against her chest. The grandstand is filled with families, some clutching small flags, others just holding each other tightly. Grace's husband Edward is beside her, along with Christa's husband Stephen and their two children, Scott and Caroline. For months, they have lived with the cameras, the interviews, the constant reminders that Christa is about to do something no other teacher has done. But in these final moments before liftoff, the world narrows to the launch pad and the countdown echoing over the loudspeakers. The air smells faintly of salt and jet fuel. Grace keeps glancing at her grandchildren, trying to read their faces. Caroline is only 6, bundled in a red coat, eyes wide. Scott, older, looks down at his sneakers. Stephen stands rigid, jaw set, watching the shuttle. The family is separated from the crowds by a rope and a line of security, but there is no protection from the press. Reporters with long lenses scan the VIP section, hoping for a shot of the McAuliffe's reaction. Grace's heart pounds as the engines ignite. She hears herself cheering, almost out of habit, swept up in the roar of hope and pride. For an instant, she lets herself believe this is the moment her daughter becomes a national hero. The sky is bright and blue. Time feels suspended. No one in the family knows how quickly that hope will be shattered. Christa McAuliffe was not an astronaut. She was a social studies teacher from Concord, New Hampshire, who loved her students and believed in the power of curiosity. In 1984, when NASA announced the Teacher in Space project, more than 11,000 educators across the country filled out applications hoping for a chance to bring the cosmos into their classrooms. Christa's essay stood out. She wrote about wanting to touch the future by teaching, a phrase that would become her legacy. NASA needed a new kind of hero. Shuttle flights were starting to feel routine and public interest was fading. Christa was chosen for her warmth, her energy, and her gift for making science feel like an invitation. She trained alongside seasoned pilots and engineers, learning to float in zero gravity, practicing the lessons she would broadcast from orbit. Her mission was simple and bold: teach 2 live lessons from space, showing millions of children that the universe was within reach. Communities rallied around her. School children sent cards and banners. Local businesses in Concord hung signs cheering her on. The White House called her selection a moment of national pride. For a few months, Christa McAuliffe became the face of American possibility, a teacher preparing to make history, carrying the hopes of classrooms from coast to coast. January 27, 1986, Morton Thiokol's Utah headquarters. Roger Boisjoli, an engineer who had spent years studying the shuttle's solid rocket boosters, stares at the temperature forecast for Florida. The numbers are bad: 28 degrees overnight, maybe 36 by launch. He knows the O-rings, rubber seals designed to keep fire from escaping the rocket joints, have never been tested below 53 degrees Fahrenheit. Below that, the rubber hardens. It might not spring back fast enough to keep the flames in. That evening, a phone line crackles to life. NASA managers from Marshall, Kennedy, and Johnson Space Centers join Thiokol's team for an emergency teleconference. Boisjoli and his colleague Arnold Thompson lay out the data. O-rings could fail in this cold. Temperature of 53 degrees is well below our database. We can't quantify what the O-rings will do. The room is tense. NASA's Larry Malloy pushes back, frustrated. "My God, Theocol, when do you want me to launch? Next April." The pressure is obvious. Robert Lund, Theocol's VP of Engineering, supports the engineers at first. But after a private management huddle, the message changes. Senior executives tell NASA there is no clear proof of danger. Joe Kilminster signs the launch authorization. Alan MacDonald, director at Kennedy, refuses to add his name. Too much risk to take. In the final hours before dawn, the decision stands. The O-rings will face the coldest launch in shuttle history. Boisjoli leaves the office defeated, certain nothing has changed. The risk is real, but the countdown will continue. 73 seconds after liftoff, the sky splits open. Challenger disintegrates in a burst of white and orange, trailing smoke against the winter blue. For a moment, no one speaks. On television, anchors stumble for words. In classrooms across the country, teachers freeze mid-sentence. At Framingham High, students stare at the screens, waiting for someone to explain what they just saw. Some think it's part of the broadcast, a trick of the camera. But the replay begins almost immediately. Again and again, the image loops. 7 lives vanishing in real time. Roughly 2.5 million children watched the disaster unfold live in their classrooms, a number multiplied in the days that follow as networks replay the footage dozens of times a day. School counselors start fielding calls from parents. Reports of nightmares, panic attacks, and fear of space travel fill school records. For Christa McAuliffe's students, the loss is personal. A teacher gone in an instant before the eyes of her own class. The country sits in collective shock, grief amplified by the relentless cycle of replayed tragedy. The moment becomes seared into memory, impossible to turn away from. June Scobie Rogers sits before a congressional panel, her voice steady as she describes the hole left in her family. She is not alone. Beside her, Cheryl McNair holds a photo of her late husband Ronald and speaks about the children who lost a father and a hero. In the months after Challenger, the families refuse to fade into private grief. They write letters, give interviews, and demand answers from NASA officials who once promised that shuttle flights were safe. When the Rogers Commission releases its findings, June and Cheryl are there, listening as investigators outline 46 recommended reforms for NASA's safety protocols. Their advocacy does not stop with hearings. June helps launch the Challenger Center for Space Science Education, a living memorial where students can experience simulated missions and learn the lessons written in loss. Cheryl travels to schools, urging young people of color to see themselves in science. The sorrow that once threatened to overwhelm becomes a force for change. Through their persistence, the families transform tragedy into a legacy of safety and inspiration, determined that future explorers will reach for the stars with open eyes. Marcia Jarvis waits in the background, away from the cameras and the press conferences. Her husband, Gregory Jarvis, was the payload specialist on Challenger, a satellite engineer, not a household name. News reports barely mention him. Most headlines focus on Christa, on the pilot, on the stories that fit the public's idea of heroism. Marcia reads articles that get Greg's job wrong, or forget him entirely. In interviews, she tries to explain who he was. A quiet problem solver, someone who loved the challenge of spaceflight but never sought the spotlight. At memorials, she stands among other grieving families, listening as speakers recite the familiar names. Sometimes Greg's is left until last or skipped over. Letters arrive from friends who only realize after the fact that he was on board. Marcia writes back, determined to keep his memory from fading. The loss is not smaller because it is less visible. For every televised tribute, there are families like the Jarvises, coping with grief that feels private and overlooked, fighting for equal remembrance in the long shadow of national tragedy. On January 28, 1986, over 85 million Americans, including Christa McAuliffe's mother Grace Corrigan, witnessed the Challenger disaster unfold live on television. The documentary has shown that NASA managers approved the launch despite engineers' warnings about the O-ring seals and the record cold temperature that morning. The families, especially those in the VIP stands, endured not only the loss of their loved ones, but also public grief amplified by constant media replay. While the Rogers Commission identified 46 safety reforms, some internal communications and decision-making details remain undisclosed or heavily redacted. Today, the legacy of Challenger endures in stricter safety protocols and the continued work of organisations like the Challenger Centre. But for the families, and for millions who watched, the questions of accountability and the true cost of ignoring warnings are not fully resolved. The Challenger disaster stands as a documented reminder: every triumph in space must be built on honesty, transparency, and the lessons written in loss.